ex-husband's parents tried to brag about their son beating his false allegations not knowing he was sitting in a jail cell, and I want to tell you about the 8 minutes during which they figured out what had actually happened. My ex-husband was named Roman. Roman and I had been married for 6 years. Roman had been emotionally abusive throughout the marriage. Roman had been escalating to physical abuse in the last year. I had left Roman 14 months ago. I had filed a police report on the way out. The police report had been about a specific incident in which Roman had hospitalized me. The thing about Roman's family was specific. Roman's family had been wealthy. Roman's family had been the kind of family that had been operating from the framing that nothing their son had done could possibly have been his fault. Roman's family had been telling everyone in their social circle that the allegations against Roman had been false. The thing was that the case had not been weak. The case had been strong. The case had included the police report. The case had included the medical records. The case had included testimony from 3 of Roman's previous girlfriends who had come forward after my filing. The case had included security footage. The trial had happened about a month before the day I am about to describe. Roman had been convicted of multiple counts of assault. Roman had been sentenced to 4 years in state prison. Roman had begun serving his sentence about 3 weeks before the day I am about to describe. The day I am about to describe was a charity gala. The gala was an annual event that I had been attending for years. I had been at my table. I had been with my new partner, whose name was Caleb. Caleb had been with me for the past 8 months. Caleb had been a kind man who had been supportive throughout the trial. Roman's parents had been at a different table. Roman's mother, whose name was Vivian, had been the kind of woman who had been holding court at her table. Vivian had been telling specific stories about how Roman had been beating the false allegations. I had been able to hear Vivian from my table because Vivian had been speaking loudly. Vivian said, "Our Roman has been so brave. The false allegations have been crushing, but we have been confident the truth would come out. The case has been resolved. Roman has been vindicated." I had decided to address it. I had stood up. I had walked to Vivian's table. I said, "Vivian, I want to clarify something you have been telling these people. Roman was convicted on multiple counts of assault 3 weeks ago. Roman is currently serving a 4-year sentence in state prison. The allegations were not false. The case was not weak. Roman was not vindicated. Please stop telling people he was." The table had been silent. Vivian had been processing in real time the fact that her social circle had been hearing all of this. Vivian had stood up and had walked out. I walked back to my table. My hands were shaking. Caleb reached for my hand under the table. He held it and he said, "You did the right thing." And I felt this wave of relief move through me, like I had been holding my breath for 14 months and I had finally let it out. A woman from the table next to ours got up from her seat. She walked over to me. She leaned down and she said it quietly. She said, "I'm glad someone finally said something." I never believed a word that woman said. For a brief moment, I thought it was over. I thought the truth had done its job. That feeling lasted maybe 4 minutes. Then I saw Vivian. She had not left the building. She had walked out of the ballroom, but she had not left. She had been in the hallway, and she had not been alone. She had been in the hallway with Aurelius. Aurelius was Roman's father. If you knew Vivian, you knew her as the loud one, the performer. Aurelius was different. Aurelius was the kind of man who sat back and watched and listened and then made one move at the right time. And now Aurelius was walking toward my table. He reached my table. He leaned down. He put one hand on the back of the empty chair next to me, and he spoke quietly. He said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding, and I'd like to speak with you privately for 2 minutes. That's all I'm asking." His tone was polite, measured. That was the dangerous part, because when someone like Aurelius sounds reasonable, it's because he has already decided what he wants to happen, and he is guiding you toward it. I should have said no, but I didn't. I told myself I wasn't afraid of them anymore. That was my mistake. Caleb stood up the second I stood up. Aurelius looked at Caleb and said, "This is a family matter." Caleb looked at Aurelius and said, "She's not your family anymore. I'm going with her." The 3 of us moved through the ballroom. Vivian was already in the hallway. She was waiting. She had been waiting. This had been planned. The doors closed behind us, and the second those doors closed, Vivian changed. Her face was tight. Her voice was low and shaking, not with sadness, with fury. She looked right at me and she said, "How dare you humiliate me in front of those people?" And that was the moment. That was the exact moment I understood what this had always been about for Vivian. She didn't say, "How dare you lie?" She said, "How dare you humiliate me?" Me, not Roman, her image, her reputation. Aurelius spoke first. His voice was level, almost professional. He said, "What you did in there was reckless. You made public statements about an ongoing legal matter." I blinked. I said, "It's not ongoing. He was convicted. He's in prison." Aurelius didn't flinch. He said, "There is an appeal in progress. Anything you say publicly could be used to complicate that appeal." I felt something cold move through me. I looked at Caleb. His jaw tightened, but I had spent 14 months learning how to think before I reacted. I said clearly, "An appeal doesn't change the conviction. He was found guilty." Aurelius said, "Convictions get overturned. You of all people should be careful about what you say and where you say it." And there it was, the thing underneath the polite tone. He wasn't asking me to be quiet. He was warning me, "Be careful." That was what Roman used to say too. Be careful, not a request. A threat wearing a suit. Vivian stepped closer. She said, "You have already taken enough from this family. You took our son, you took his reputation, you took his freedom, and now you come to a charity event and you try to take our dignity." And I felt it. The old pull, the old guilt, the thing that had been planted in me during 6 years of marriage to Roman. My chest got tight. I could feel myself starting to shrink. And then I caught myself. I had spent 14 months in therapy, learning that the guilt was not mine. I said, "I didn't take anything from Roman. Roman took things from me. He took 6 years. He took my safety. He put me in a hospital." My voice was steady. Vivian's face changed. And then she said the thing that changed everything about this conversation. She said, "You were always dramatic. You always exaggerated. Even when you were married to him, you made everything into a crisis." I went still, because what Vivian had just said was not a defense of Roman. It was a claim that I had been too much. The only way you say something like that is if you know the things happened. You don't call someone dramatic about things that never happened. I looked at Vivian and I said, "Vivian, were you aware of what Roman was doing during the marriage?" The hallway was quiet. Vivian looked at me and she said, "I was aware that you were difficult." I said, "That's not what I asked." The silence that followed was the heaviest silence I had ever stood inside of. If she said yes, She knew, then she was complicit. If she said no, she didn't know, then calling me dramatic made no sense. Aurelius put a hand on Vivian's arm. He said, "That's enough, Vivian." And the way he said it was a man telling his wife to stop talking because she was getting close to the thing they had both agreed never to say out loud. Caleb spoke. It was the first time he had said anything since we had walked into the hallway. His voice was clear. He said, "You knew. You both knew what he was doing to her, and you helped him cover it." Aurelius turned to Caleb. His eyes were cold. He said, "We are not having this conversation." Caleb said, "You've been having this conversation for 14 months. You've just been having it without her in the room." Vivian was starting to crack. She pulled out her phone and held it up like it was a weapon. She said, "I'm calling our attorney." I said, "Call whoever you want." I stated facts. Public record. My voice didn't shake. Vivian's thumb hovered over her phone screen. She didn't dial. She just stood there. Aurelius looked at me. The calm was thinner now. He said, "You are making a mistake you will regret." I said, "I made my mistake 6 years ago when I married your son. Everything since then has been correction." Aurelius's mouth tightened. There was no lawyerly comeback for a woman telling you that the worst thing she ever did was join your family. And then a door opened behind us. A woman stepped through it. I recognized her. Her name was Dakota. She was on the gala organizing committee. Dakota stopped when she saw the four of us. She could read the room. Dakota said, "Is everything all right out here?" Aurelius switched instantly. His voice changed to something warm and easy. He said, "Everything is fine. Just a private conversation." But Dakota didn't leave. She looked at me, and she said, "I heard what you said at the table. I looked it up on my phone. The conviction is right there on the court records website." I watched Vivian's face change. It was like watching something collapse in slow motion. Dakota said, "I showed a few people at my table. They looked it up too." Aurelius tried. He looked at Dakota and his voice was still polite, but there was an edge now. He said, "This is a private family matter and I would appreciate discretion." Dakota looked at him. Then she looked at Vivian, and she said, "Mrs. Black, you've been telling people at this event for 3 years that your son was innocent. That's not a private matter. You made it public." And that was it. But Vivian wasn't done. Vivian made one final attempt. She stepped toward me, and her voice dropped to something I had never heard from her before. Something raw and broken and real. She said, "I visited him last week, in that place." He looked at me through the glass and he said, "Mom, please don't let them forget who I really am. He's my son. He will always be my son. I cannot say what you need me to say." And I felt it. The human part of me that was just a person. That part of me understood a mother sitting across from her son in a prison visiting room. That part of me felt compassion. Real compassion. For about 3 seconds. And then I remembered the hospital bed. I remembered the fluorescent lights. I remembered the 3 other women who had sat on that witness stand. And I heard what Vivian had said. Who I really am. Like the man who had done those things was a different person. I said, "Vivian, I understand he is your son. But who he really is, that's who the jury convicted. That's who those other women described. That's who put me in the hospital. You don't get to choose which version of him is real." Vivian's eyes filled with tears. Real ones. She didn't wipe them. Aurelius took her arm. He said, "We're leaving." He started guiding Vivian toward the exit. But Vivian turned. Right before they reached the door, she turned back to look at me one more time. And she said, "You'll never know what it's like to have your child taken from you." The hallway went quiet. Caleb's hand found the small of my back, and I looked at Vivian, at this woman who had watched her son hurt me and called me dramatic, who was standing in a hallway telling me I would never understand her pain. And I said, "You're right," because Roman made sure I never had the chance to find out. He was too busy making sure I survived each day. Vivian's face went blank. Aurelius pushed open the door. The night air came in, and then they were gone. The door closed behind them, and then the door opened again. Aurelius stepped back through it alone. He had stopped. He had turned around, and for the first time all night, something in his face had changed. A tightening around his eyes, like my last words had followed him through that door. He looked at me and he said, "What did you just say?" His voice was different. The professional tone was gone. I said Roman took the possibility of children from me. The hospitalization, the injuries. The doctors told me the damage was significant. That was the thing I had never said publicly. That was the thing that wasn't in the court records. That was the thing I had carried for 14 months in a place so deep inside me that I didn't even talk about it in therapy for the first 6 months. Caleb put his hand on my back. I was steady. Aurelius looked past me toward the exit door, which was still cracked open. Vivian was standing just on the other side of it. Something passed between them. Vivian stepped back into the hallway. The fury was gone. She looked like someone who had just been hit by something she never saw coming. She said, "I didn't. He never said." And her voice broke. I said, "Of course he didn't. He told you I was dramatic. He told you I exaggerated, and you believed him. Every single time you chose to believe him." Vivian said nothing. For the first time in 14 months, Vivian had nothing to say. No narrative, no defense, no spin, just silence. Just a woman standing in a hallway in an expensive dress, realizing that the story she had been telling everyone, including herself, was never true. Aurelius took her arm, gently this time. He guided her toward the exit. He did not look back. The door closed behind them, and this time they did not come back. I stood in the hallway. Caleb was beside me. Dakota looked at me and she said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I don't know yet." Caleb said, "You don't have to go back in there." I looked at the ballroom doors. I could hear the music through them. I said, "Yes, I do. I have a seat at that table. I earned it." And I walked back into the gala. I sat back down at my table. The gala continued around me. The music played. Nobody whispered. A woman from 2 tables over caught my eye and gave me a small nod. That was enough. After a few minutes, my phone lit up on the table. It was Matthias. He said he saw my missed calls from earlier and asked if I was okay. I typed back, "I'm at the gala. I'll tell you everything tomorrow, but I'm okay. I'm actually okay." I looked across the ballroom at the table where Vivian and Aurelius had been sitting. Their table was half empty now. Their coats were gone. Their version of the story walked out the door with them. The version that remained was the one supported by a police report, medical records, 3 other women's testimony, security footage, and a jury's unanimous verdict. I picked up my glass of water. I took a sip. I stayed for the rest of the evening. I didn't leave early. I didn't hide. I earned my seat at that table long before tonight, and no one was going to make me give it up.